June 1942. Engineers from Cambridge were taking apart carburetors. They were trying to solve a fuel problem that was making Britain lose battles in North Africa. At the same time, an 18-year-old Canadian farm kid with only an 8th grade education picked up a jerry can, some cork, and a spring. In just 3 weeks, he accidentally made it so Allied trucks could travel 3 times farther. How did a fix so simple that it cost less than £3 per truck get past every military expert, engineer, and officer in the British Army? A muddy supply base outside Southampton, England. It had been raining for 3 days. The motor pool was a soup of oil and mud that stuck to every boot. Private Tommy Atkinson kneeled next to a Bedford truck. He watched gasoline drip from its fuel tank onto the ground. Every drop was another mile the truck couldn't travel. Another supply box that wouldn't reach General Montgomery's men fighting Rommel in the desert. Another day closer to losing the war. This is the true story of how an 18-year-old Canadian mechanic found a simple fuel fix. It would make convoys go 3 times farther and change armies forever. But on that wet morning in Southampton, nobody was listening to Tommy. Nobody thought a farm kid from Saskatchewan could solve a problem that had stumped Britain's best military minds. The numbers were bad. British convoys were losing 40% of their fuel before a single truck even went into battle. 40%. That meant for every 10 gallons loaded in England, only 6 gallons powered trucks in North Africa. The other 4 gallons disappeared. They evaporated into the air, spilled on the ground, or burned up in engines running on bad fuel. 1 out of every 3 supply runs never reached Montgomery's men. The truck just ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Their important cargo was left in the sand while Rommel's army moved forward. The British Army was bleeding fuel, and the bleeding was getting worse. Without good supply lines, the whole North African war was about to fall apart. Tanks sat empty. Artillery couldn't be moved. Soldiers went without food and water because the supply trucks never arrived. Rommel understood this. He watched British convoys stop and die in the desert like hurt animals. Every failed supply run gave him another day, another mile, another win. Tommy Atkinson was nobody special. He grew up on a wheat farm near Moose Jaw during the Great Depression. His dad taught him to fix tractors and trucks with wire and prayers because new parts cost too much. Tommy never went past 8th grade. School ended when his dad needed him full time on the farm. But Tommy understood machines, like some people understand music. He could listen to an engine and know what was wrong. He could look at a broken machine and see how to fix it. When the war came, Tommy joined on his 18th birthday. The Army tested him and sent him to the motor pool as a mechanic. Not an engineer, not an officer. Just a private who fixed broken trucks. That's what he was doing in Southampton in June 1942. He was fixing trucks for North Africa, watching fuel drip on the ground, and wondering why nobody cared. The British military did care. They cared a lot. They had their best engineers trying to solve the fuel crisis. Men from Cambridge and Oxford, experts in engines and fuel, worked day and night. Their solution was to change the carburetors on every truck. Smaller jets, different floats, new air, fuel mixes. They tried many designs. The changes helped a little. Trucks used maybe 12% less fuel on a good day. But the changes were expensive, took a long time, and needed skilled mechanics, and 12% was not enough. Not even close. Other experts suggested fuel additives, special chemicals to mix into the gasoline. The additives worked in lab tests. But shipping millions of gallons of special chemicals to North Africa was impossible. The supply chain couldn't handle it. The convoys that were supposed to carry the additives couldn't reach their destination because they ran out of fuel. It was a problem that ate its own solution. Top commanders thought about giving up on long desert trips. Maybe the convoys couldn't be fixed. Maybe British forces would have to stay near the coast. Maybe Rommel would win, because the British couldn't figure out how to move gasoline 400 miles across the desert without losing most of it. Tommy watched all of this. He watched the engineers work on carburetors. He watched officers argue about additives. He watched convoys leave with full tanks and come back with stories of trucks dying in the desert. And Tommy noticed something nobody else saw. The fuel was cooking away in the jerry cans before it even reached the engines. Those big steel containers sat in the sun all day. The metal got hot. The gasoline inside got hot. Hot gasoline evaporates. The standard jerry cans had big vent holes to stop pressure from building up. But those same vent holes let gasoline vapor pour out. By the time a convoy reached North Africa, the cans held 15 liters instead of 20. And the fuel left was bad from the heat, making engines run rough. Tommy told this to the head mechanic in his unit, a sergeant who had been fixing trucks since before Tommy was born. The sergeant barely looked up. "Kid, we have Cambridge engineers on this. You think they haven't thought about the fuel cans. The problem is the engines. That's what the experts are doing. Get back to work." But Tommy couldn't let it go. He grew up on a farm where gasoline was precious. His dad taught him to store fuel in sealed containers, kept cool and out of the sun, never in open cans where it could evaporate. Tommy spent his childhood making fuel last. Now he was watching the British Army waste fuel like water. They focused on complicated engine changes while ignoring the simple fact that half their gasoline was evaporating before anyone even tried to burn it. The problem wasn't the engine, Tommy thought. The problem was how they stored and moved the fuel itself. But he was 18 with an 8th grade education. Who would listen to him? Tommy couldn't sleep. Every night he lay in his bunk, thinking about those jerry cans cooking in the sun, letting precious fuel vanish into the air while engineers worked on carburetors. He remembered something from his childhood, a memory that wouldn't leave him alone. His dad used to store gasoline in old milk cans during the summer. Not just any milk cans, but sealed ones that he buried halfway in the ground behind the barn, where the earth stayed cool. The gas lasted longer that way. It didn't evaporate. It didn't go bad in the heat. His dad learned that trick during the Depression when every drop of fuel mattered. What if the British Army was solving the wrong problem? What if those smart engineers were looking in the wrong place? Tommy started thinking about the jerry cans themselves. The standard 20-liter steel containers had 3-inch vent holes at the top. This let air in as fuel poured out and stopped pressure from building up. That made sense in theory. But those big holes also let vapor escape all the time. Hot fuel created vapor. Vapor escaped through the vents. A 20-liter can become a 15-liter can without anyone noticing until the can felt too light. Tommy's idea was very simple. Don't change the engines. Change the cans. Make the vent holes much smaller. Add a valve that lets air in when needed but keeps vapor from escaping. And do something about the heat. Find a way to keep the fuel cooler, even when the can sits in the sun for hours. He started testing in secret. After his normal work, Tommy would stay late in the motor pool. He worked by lamplight when everyone else was asleep. He took a damaged jerry can from the scrap pile. Using a drill and files, he made the 3-inch vent hole only 1/8 of an inch wide. Just a tiny opening. Then he needed a valve. Something that would open under pressure when someone poured fuel out, but stay closed tight the rest of the time. Tommy found a small spring in a box of parts. He tested it carefully. He found it needed exactly 2.12 pounds of pressure per square inch to open. That was perfect. Enough to let fuel pour out smoothly, but not enough to let vapor escape during storage. He made a simple valve using the spring and a brass piece from a broken fuel pump. The valve sat in the small vent hole. The spring kept it closed. It only opened when pressure built up during pouring. But Tommy wasn't finished. He had to fix the heat problem. Walking through the workshop one night, he saw cork gaskets that had been taken off engines. The cork was thin and had interesting features. Cork didn't conduct heat well. It insulated. Tommy cut strips of cork and glued them to the inside of his test jerry can. The cork covered the inside walls and bottom. It made a thin barrier between the hot metal and the fuel inside. 3 weeks passed. Tommy worked every night changing jerry cans, one at a time. He used scrap materials from around the motor pool. Nobody paid attention to what the kid was doing in the corner after hours. He changed 50 cans. Each one got the smaller vent hole, the spring valve, and the cork lining. He tested the valves over and over. They had to open at exactly 2.12 pounds of pressure. Too tight and fuel wouldn't pour. Too loose and vapor would escape. He filled cans with water and practiced pouring. His changed can actually poured 40% faster because the valve opened fully under pressure. But the rest of the time it was sealed tight. Tommy filled 2 of his changed cans with gasoline. He put them in the sun next to 2 regular cans, also filled with fuel. After 8 hours of direct sun, he measured the temperature. The regular cans were 86 VF. His changed cans with cork were 78 WF. That's 8 degrees cooler. He could feel the difference just by touching the cans. Less heat meant less evaporation and better fuel. Now came the hard part. Tommy had to convince someone to test his change on a real convoy. He went to his supervisor again, the same sergeant who had ignored him weeks before. This time, Tommy brought numbers. He showed the sergeant his temperature tests, his evaporation tests, his pouring speed tests. The sergeant looked at the numbers, looked at the changed cans, and shook his head. This isn't your job, Private. You're a mechanic, not an engineer. You want to change how the whole Army handles fuel. That's way above your pay grade. But there was one person who might listen. Sergeant Bill McPhersonson ran the convoy operations from Southampton. Tommy had worked on McPhersonson's truck before. The older man was always decent to him. McPhersonson was also desperate. His convoys kept failing. They kept running out of gas, and men were dying because supplies didn't get through. Desperate men take chances. Tommy found McPhersonson on June 27, 1942. He brought 2 changed jerry cans and his notebook full of numbers. McPhersonson listened, which was more than anyone else had done. He looked at the spring valve, tested it with his thumb, watched it open and close. He picked up both cans, felt their weight. Then he asked Tommy a simple question. How much did this cost you to make? Tommy did the math. Scrap spring, scrap brass, scrap cork, a little glue. Maybe 3 per can, Sergeant. Maybe less if we buy materials in bulk. A McPhersonson whistled. The carburetor changes cost over $200 per truck. "All right, kid. I've got a convoy leaving tomorrow. 400 miles inland and back. I'll use your fancy cans on my supply truck. We'll see if they make a difference." That was all Tommy needed. He stayed up all night preparing 20 changed cans for McPherson's truck. He checked every valve, every seal. The convoy left at dawn on June 28th. They measured fuel levels before leaving and after returning. McPherson's truck left with 120 liters of fuel in changed cans. The other trucks carried regular cans. 4 days later, the convoy returned. The regular trucks had lost an average of 22% of their fuel to evaporation and spills. McPherson's truck lost only 6% instead of 22%. And the fuel left was cooler and cleaner. McPherson's truck also had better engine performance. It ran smoother and cooler. McPherson took the results straight to Major Edmund Blackwood. Blackwood was the logistics officer for all supply convoys. He was watching his supply lines fall apart because of fuel loss he couldn't control. When McPherson showed him Tommy's numbers, Blackwood made a big decision. He ordered a full field test, 200 vehicles, half with regular jerry cans, half with Tommy's changes, a 600-mile route made to feel like North Africa. Every vehicle's fuel use was tracked carefully. It took Tommy and a team of 30 mechanics 2 weeks to change 5,000 jerry cans. They worked day and night, putting in valves and cork linings. The motor pool became a jerry can factory. The test convoy went out in late July. When it returned 5 days later, the results were clear. Vehicles with changed cans arrived with 68% more usable fuel than the others. 68%, not 12% like the carburetor changes, not 8% like the additives. 68% more fuel. That meant more range, more supplies delivered, more lives saved. The numbers changed everything. Before Tommy's change in May 1942, British convoys got about 4.2 miles per gallon when you counted all the losses from evaporation and bad fuel. 35% of every gallon loaded in England never did useful work in Africa. It just vanished. After the change was used in September, the same convoy system got 6.8 miles per gallon. Losses in transit were only 9%. The effective range increase was under 87%. Tommy had promised to triple convoy range, and the math showed he almost did. Major Blackwood didn't wait for permission from higher command. He couldn't afford to wait. By October 1942, 47,000 changed jerry cans were in use in North Africa. Mechanics worked in shifts, changing regular cans to Tommy's design as fast as they could. The change was simple enough that any mechanic with basic tools could do it in the field. By January 1943, over 200,000 changed cans were used across all European battles. The Canadian Army heard what one of their farm boys did and used the change right away. The Americans were slower to believe it. But by March 1943, even they were changing their fuel cans to the Atkinson design. The difference with other solutions was embarrassing for the experts. The carburetor changes from Cambridge engineers gave a 12-cent improvement at best. Each one cost over $50 and needed a skilled mechanic for half a day. Tommy's change cost $3 per can. Anyone could do it, and it took 20 minutes. The fuel additives would have helped maybe 8%, but shipping special chemicals was a nightmare. Tommy's solution gave a 68% improvement using materials already available everywhere. Look at Operation Beresford in August 1942, before the change. The British sent 45 trucks with 18,000 liters of fuel to resupply a position 380 miles into the desert. Only 28 trucks made it. They arrived with just 200 liters. 54% of the fuel was lost. The mission failed. Soldiers went on half rations. Compare that to a similar mission after the change in December 1942. A 40-truck convoy made the same trip. All 40 trucks arrived. They delivered 16,800 liters out of 18,000, only a 7% loss. The mission succeeded because Tommy Atkinson looked at a jerry can and asked a simple question nobody else had asked. German intelligence noticed the change by November 1942. Rommel's officers were confused. British supply lines were suddenly reaching places they shouldn't be able to reach. Rommel wrote to Berlin about an inexplicable extension of British logistics. German engineers captured some changed cans and studied them. They tried to copy them but missed the important details. The exact spring tension, the vent hole size, the cork thickness. Close wasn't good enough. The impact showed in big battles. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, British tanks could chase Rommel's retreating army 40 miles farther than before. That extra 40 miles made a huge difference. Rommel's army couldn't set up new defenses because British tanks kept coming and never ran out of fuel. During the Operation Torch landings, the better fuel efficiency let planners ship 30% less fuel. That freed up cargo space on 340 ships for ammunition, food, and medicine instead. The British Army officially recognized what Tommy did in December 1942. They called it the Atkinson valve modification. Every new jerry can made in British factories after June 1943 had Tommy's design built in. The change became so normal that soldiers didn't even know their cans were special. They just worked better. In April 1943, Tommy was made a lieutenant. An 18-year-old farm kid with an 8th grade education became an officer. He saved the British Army millions of liters of fuel and maybe saved the whole North African War. After the war, the full story became clear. Between 1942 and 1945, Tommy's change saved about 47 million liters of fuel for Allied forces everywhere. That was like freeing up 340 cargo ships for other supplies. Field Marshal Montgomery wrote that better logistics were key to winning in North Africa. He didn't say Tommy's name, but the improvements he talked about were built on Tommy's changed jerry cans. Tommy's legacy kept growing. NASA engineers in the 1960s looked at the Atkinson valve when designing fuel systems for the Apollo moon missions. Modern military forces still use better versions of Tommy's design. The commercial trucking industry saves billions of gallons of fuel every year using vapor recovery systems, based on his pressure valve idea. Sometimes the biggest discoveries cost almost nothing. They don't need years of research or millions of dollars. Sometimes they just need one person who looks at an old problem in a new way. Someone who isn't so educated that they forget how to see the obvious. The Cambridge engineers were brilliant. They knew all about engines. But they had never stored gasoline in milk cans behind a barn during the Depression. They had never learned that waste is a sin. Tommy learned that before he was 10. That let him see what the experts couldn't. An 18-year-old farm kid with an 8th grade education saw what trained engineers missed. He looked at a jerry can and asked, "What if we're using this wrong?" That simple question tripled fuel efficiency, helped win a war, and reminded everyone that common sense can beat fancy degrees every time. Tommy never accepted that things couldn't be better. He changed World War II with a spring, some cork, and common sense. The kind of common sense that says problems exist to be solved, not just accepted.